Tonight on Gay Timeline, we are turning back the clock to 1880s New York City, where the gaslight flickers on cobblestones slick with horse manure and melting snow, and in certain boarding houses south of 14th Street, men gather in parlors after dark to play cards, drink whiskey, and, very quietly, touch hands across tables where the landlady will not see. I am Julian. This is Gay Timeline. In the autumn of 1889, in a narrow brick boarding house on Bleecker Street, a 23-year-old clerk named Ralph Werther climbed 4 flights of stairs to a cramped attic room he shared with 2 other men. Ralph worked days at a dry goods warehouse on Canal Street. He earned $11 a week. By all outward accounts, he was unremarkable, pale, slight, prone to colds, the kind of young man the city swallowed by the thousands. But Ralph Werther kept a secret the warehouse manager would never have guessed. 3 nights a week, he slipped out of his boarding house after 10 o'clock, walked south to a different address on McDougal Street, and entered a world the newspapers called degenerate and the police called criminal. Ralph called it the only place in the city where he could breathe. The historian George Chauncey spent years in the archives mapping the hidden geography of gay New York in this era. What he found were addresses, dozens of them. Boarding houses clustered in the Bowery, the Tenderloin, Greenwich Village, places where landladies asked no questions and men rented rooms by the week with no references required. Chauncey called these boarding houses the invisible infrastructure of queer life. Without them, he argued, there would have been no gay New York at all. To understand why Ralph Werther risked arrest and ruin to walk those streets at night, you have to understand what it meant to be a man who loved men in Gilded Age America, and how a few narrow houses south of 14th Street became the only refuge in a city of 3 million people who would have destroyed him if they knew. If you find yourself drawn into this story, the like and subscribe buttons are there for you, but only if this is genuinely your kind of evening. And let me know in the comments where you are tuning in from and what time it is for you. It is always fascinating to see who is joining us from around the world. Now, let us go back to Bleecker Street. For most of history, men like Ralph were alone. They wrote letters no one would read. They loved in rooms no one would visit. Tonight, we keep them company. That is all sleep needs to be, a quiet act of refusing to let someone be forgotten. By the end of tonight, you will know why a boarding house landlady named Matilda Herman became the most important woman in the lives of hundreds of gay men she never publicly acknowledged. Why the address 21 East 4th Street appeared in police blotters 17 times between 1885 and 1892, and what Ralph Werther wrote in his diary the night he realized he was not the only one. Congratulations. You have just woken up in a rented room in Lower Manhattan, September 1888. You share this room with 2 other clerks. One of them snores. The mattress smells faintly of mildew, and the previous tenant's hair oil. Let us see if you can survive without getting arrested, beaten, or thrown into the street by a landlord who discovers what you are. Good luck. The first thing you need to understand about gay New York in the 1880s is that it did not officially exist. There were no gay bars, no clubs, no organizations, no newspapers with coded personal ads. The word homosexual had just been coined in German medical journals, and most Americans had never heard it. The word gay still meant cheerful. If you were a man who desired other men, you had no language for what you were, no map to find others like you, and no legal right to exist. New York's sodomy law, revised in 1881, made any sexual contact between men punishable by up to 20 years in prison. The law did not require penetration. A kiss could land you in Sing Sing. The statute was vague enough that prosecutors could, and did, use it to destroy men on the flimsiest evidence. A letter, a witness who claimed to have seen 2 men embrace, a landlord's suspicion. And yet, in the same decade that the law tightened, the gay world of New York exploded into visibility. Not in the open, never in the open, but in the margins, the shadows, the spaces the respectable world did not bother to police. Boarding houses were the center of that world. Let me paint you a picture of what a typical boarding house looked like in this era, because the architecture mattered. These were narrow brick row houses, 4 or 5 stories tall, built in the 1840s and 50s when Lower Manhattan was still residential. By the 1880s, the wealthy had moved uptown. The old houses south of 14th Street were subdivided, chopped up, rented out room by room to the army of young clerks, shop workers, seamstresses, and strivers who flooded into the city every year looking for work. A boarding house room in 1888 cost between $2 and $4 a week. For that, you got a bed, sometimes a chair, sometimes a washstand. You shared the room with 1, 2, sometimes 3 other men. Privacy was a fantasy. The walls were thin. You could hear your neighbor cough, turn over in bed, argue with his roommate. The only heat came from a coal stove on the ground floor. In winter, the upper rooms were freezing. In summer, they were ovens. Most boarding houses were run by widows or older women who needed the income. The landlady lived on the first floor. She collected rent on Saturdays. She enforced the house rules. No loud noise after 10. No women in the men's rooms. No cooking in the bedrooms. Some landladies were strict. Some were lenient. And some, a handful, scattered across the Bowery and the Village, were willing to look the other way when the men who rented from them brought home other men instead of women. Ralph Werther first arrived in New York in the spring of 1887. He was 21. He had grown up in a small town in Pennsylvania, the youngest son of a Methodist minister. He had known since he was 14 that he was different. He did not want to marry. He did not want women. He wanted something he had no name for, something that made him feel sick with shame and alive with longing at the same time. In his autobiography, published decades later under a pseudonym, Ralph described the first time he walked past a certain boarding house on MacDougal Street and saw 2 young men standing in the doorway laughing, one of them resting his hand on the other's shoulder. Ralph wrote, "I knew instantly what they were, and I knew they were what I was. And for the first time in my life, I did not feel alone." The house Ralph saw that day was number 73 MacDougal Street. It was run by a woman named Matilda Herman. Matilda Herman is one of the most important figures in early gay New York, and almost nobody has heard of her. She left no letters, no photographs, no diary. What we know about her comes from police records, from the memoirs of men like Ralph who rented from her, and from the arrest reports of the vice squads who raided her house in 1889 and again in 1891. Matilda was German. She was in her 50s. She had been widowed twice. She spoke English with a thick accent and ran her boarding house with what the police reports called lax morals and what her tenants called kindness. She rented rooms to young men, mostly clerks and shop workers, mostly in their 20s. And she did not ask questions. By the late 1880s, 73 MacDougal Street had a reputation. Men who needed a place to live. Men who had been thrown out of other boarding houses for reasons landladies did not name out loud, knew they could find a room at Matilda's. Men who wanted to meet other men knew they could linger in Matilda's front parlour after dark and strike up a conversation with a stranger who might become something more. The historian Chad Heap, working through court records from the period, found 17 men arrested in or near Matilda Herman's boarding house between 1887 and 1892. 17 men who lived at that one address, charged with sodomy, indecent exposure, or disorderly conduct. The catch-all charge police used when they wanted to arrest someone, but could not prove a specific crime. 17 arrests in 5 years. And yet Matilda's house stayed open. She was never prosecuted. She was never evicted. Why? Because Matilda Herman understood something the police did not want to admit. The city needed places like her boarding house, not officially, not legally, but practically. New York in the 1880s was a city of young single men, tens of thousands of them, clerks and labourers and students and drifters, living in rented rooms with no family to supervise them. The official story was that these young men worked hard, saved their wages, married respectable girls, and became solid citizens. The reality was messier. The reality included men who drank too much, men who visited brothels, men who gambled, and men who, quietly, carefully, found each other in the narrow margin between work and sleep. The police tolerated the gay boarding houses for the same reason they tolerated the brothels 2 blocks over. As long as the trouble stayed contained, as long as it did not spill into the respectable neighborhoods uptown, as long as the newspapers did not get wind of it, the city could pretend it did not exist. Matilda's house had rules. You did not bring men home during the day. You did not make noise. You did not flaunt. The front parlor was for conversation. What happened upstairs, behind closed doors, was your own business. But the doors stayed closed. Ralph Werther rented a room at 73 McDougal Street in the fall of 1888. He shared the room with a man named Tom, a printer's apprentice from Ohio. The room was on the 3rd floor. It had one narrow bed, one chair, one window that looked out onto a brick wall. The rent was $3 a week, split between them. Ralph and Tom were not lovers. They were friends. They were alibi. In a city where 2 men sharing a room was normal, expected even, for men of their class, Ralph and Tom's arrangement raised no suspicions. They worked different shifts. Tom worked days. Ralph worked evenings at the warehouse. Most nights, they barely saw each other. But on Saturday nights, when Tom went out to the dance halls in the Bowery, Ralph stayed in. And when Ralph came home after midnight, smelling of whiskey and another man's cologne, Tom asked no questions. This was the unspoken contract of the gay boarding houses. You protected each other. You covered for each other. You did not ask, and you did not tell. Ralph wrote in his diary about the first time he brought a man back to the room on McDougal Street. It was November. The man's name was Edward. They had met in the front parlor 2 weeks earlier. Edward worked at a bookshop on 4th Avenue. He was 25, dark-haired, from Virginia. They had talked 3 times. Careful, public conversations about nothing important, before Edward asked, very quietly, if Ralph wanted to take a walk. They walked for an hour, down McDougal to Houston, east toward the Bowery, past the old churches and the new tenements and the oyster bars still open at 11 at night. They did not touch. They barely looked at each other. But Ralph knew. He wrote, "I knew he was asking a question, and I knew I was saying yes." When they came back to 73 McDougal Street, the front door was unlocked. Matilda Herman was asleep. The house was dark except for one gaslight burning low in the hall. Ralph and Edward climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor. Tom was out. The room was freezing. They did not light a lamp. They sat on the edge of the narrow bed, shoulders touching, breath visible in the cold air, and for a long time neither of them moved. Then Edward kissed him. Ralph wrote, "I had never been kissed before. I had imagined it 1,000 times, but I had never believed it would happen. The world did not allow it, and yet here it was, here he was. And for one night the world could go to hell." They saw each other twice a week for 5 months. Always at night. Always in Ralph's room, or in Edward's rented room on East 4th Street, or once, dangerously, in a basement coffeehouse on Bleecker, where the owner let men sit in the back corner until 2 in the morning and pretended not to notice who left with whom. In March 1889, Edward disappeared. Ralph went to the bookshop on 4th Avenue. The manager said Edward had quit. No forwarding address. Ralph went to Edward's boarding house. The landlord said Edward had moved out in the middle of the night, 2 weeks' rent unpaid. Ralph never saw him again. He did not know if Edward had been arrested or threatened or simply scared. He did not know if Edward had left the city or just gone to ground. He wrote, "Men like us vanish all the time. One day they are there, and the next day they are gone, and you never find out why. You learn not to ask. You learn that love for us is always temporary." But Ralph stayed at 73 McDougal Street. And in the months after Edward left, Ralph began to notice something. He was not alone. There were a dozen men living in Matilda's house that spring. Maybe more. Men in their 20s, mostly. Clerks and shop workers and one aspiring actor who never got cast in anything. They passed each other on the stairs. They nodded. They did not talk. But Ralph began to recognize the signs. The man on the 4th floor who came home late on Saturday nights, coat buttoned wrong. The 2 men on the 2nd floor who were obviously a couple, obviously careful, obviously terrified. The younger man who worked at the cigar factory and always looked exhausted and always looked like he was waiting for someone. One night in May, Ralph came home and found 4 men sitting in Matilda's front parlour. It was past 11. The gas lights were low. One of the men was playing the piano, badly, but no one seemed to care. Another was pouring whiskey into chipped teacups. They were laughing. Not loud, not reckless, just laughing. One of them looked up and saw Ralph in the doorway. He smiled. He said, "You look thirsty. Come sit." Ralph sat. They did not talk about what they were. They did not use words like invert or degenerate or any of the medical terms that were just beginning to creep into the newspapers. They talked about work, about the landlady's terrible coffee, about the new play at the Union Square Theatre, about nothing and everything. And Ralph realized slowly that this was what he had been searching for. Not just a lover, not just sex, but this. A room full of men who understood. Men who did not need him to explain. Men who were just as afraid and just as lonely and just as determined to carve out a few hours of joy in a world that wanted them dead. He wrote, "For the first time in my life, I was not pretending. I was not hiding. I was just myself, and it was the best night of my life." Matilda Herman's boarding house was not the only one. There were others. The historian Timothy Guilfoyle, digging through arrest records and vice squad reports, found at least 24 addresses between 1880 and 1895 where police noted the presence of inverts, fairies, or men of questionable character. Most of these addresses were boarding houses. Some were in the Bowery. Some were in the Tenderloin, the neighbourhood west of Broadway between 23rd and 42nd Streets, where the brothels and dance halls clustered. A few were in Greenwich Village, which in the 1880s was not yet bohemian, but was already becoming a place where the rules were a little looser, the landladies a little less strict. The most famous address, famous in the sense that it appeared in police records more than any other, was 21 East 4th Street. This was a 4-story brick boarding house run by a woman named Anna Muller. Anna was younger than Matilda Herman, maybe 40, and by all accounts, tougher. She had been arrested twice for running a disorderly house, the legal term for any residence where the police suspected immoral activity. Both times the charges were dropped. Anna had friends. She paid the right people. She knew how to survive. 21. East 4th Street was not exclusively a gay boarding house. Anna rented rooms to women as well as men, but the 3rd and 4th floors were known. Men who wanted privacy rented rooms on the upper floors. Men who wanted company knew to arrive after dark and knock twice. The police raided 21 East 4th Street in April 1890. They arrested 6 men. The charges ranged from sodomy to public indecency to disorderly conduct. 3 of the men were sentenced to 6 months in the workhouse on Blackwell's Island. 1 was sentenced to a year in Sing Sing. 2 were released after their families paid fines, which tells you something about class and who the law really punished. Anna Muller was not arrested. She was questioned. She told the police she had no idea what the men in her boarding house did behind closed doors. She said she ran a respectable establishment. She said if the police had evidence of criminal activity, they should present it. They did not. She kept her boarding house. The raid made the newspapers, not the front page. A small column on page 7 of the New York World, under the headline, "Disorderly House Raided on 4th Street." The article did not name the men arrested. It did not describe what they were accused of doing. It used the phrase, "unnatural acts," and left the rest to the reader's imagination. For the men who lived in Anna Muller's house, and for the men who lived in boarding houses like it all over Lower Manhattan, the message was clear. You are tolerated, but you are not safe. You can have your rooms and your whispered conversations and your stolen kisses, but the police can take it all away whenever they want. So you stay quiet, you stay careful, and you hope that when the next raid comes, it is someone else's door they knock on. Ralph Werther lived at 73 McDougal Street for 2 years. In that time, he met dozens of men. Some became friends, some became lovers, brief, cautious affairs that lasted weeks or months before one of them moved away or got scared or simply stopped coming around. Ralph learned to recognize the others by the way they dressed, the way they walked, the way they looked at each other across a crowded room. He learned the codes: a red necktie, a certain way of standing, a glance held just a second too long. He also learned the danger. In the summer of 1890, Ralph was walking home from work when he saw 2 police officers dragging a young man out of a boarding house on Bleecker Street. The young man was crying. His shirt was torn. One of the officers hit him across the face and told him to shut up. Ralph kept walking. He did not look back. He wrote in his diary that night, "I do not know his name. I do not know what he did. I only know that could have been me." The police in the 1880s did not have a dedicated vice squad yet. That would come later, in the 1890s. But they had informants. They had neighbours who complained. They had landladies who, unlike Matilda Herman and Anna Muller, decided cooperation with the police was safer than protection of their tenants. And they had the law on their side. The men arrested in these raids had no legal defence. Sodomy was a felony. The burden of proof was low. A policeman's testimony was enough. If you were caught in a room with another man, if your landlord reported suspicious behaviour, if a neighbour claimed to have heard something through the walls, that was enough. You went to trial. You were convicted. You went to prison. Most men did not fight the charges. Fighting meant a public trial. A public trial meant your name in the newspapers. Your name in the newspapers meant your family found out. Your employer found out. Your life was over. So most men pled guilty, took the sentence, and disappeared. Ralph Werther never forgot that. He wrote, "We lived on borrowed time. Every night I came home safe was a gift. Every morning I woke up without a knock on the door was a miracle. I did not think about the future. I did not think about growing old. I thought about today. I thought about tonight. I thought about the next hour and the next kiss and the next moment of feeling like I was not alone." The boarding houses gave Ralph that. They gave it to hundreds of men. They were not utopias. They were not safe. But they were something. They were a crack in the wall of a world that wanted men like Ralph to disappear. And through that crack, a little light got in. By 1891, Ralph Werther had been living in gay New York for 4 years. He knew the addresses. He knew which boarding houses welcomed men like him and which ones did not. He knew which saloons on the Bowery let men dance together in the back room after midnight. He knew which Turkish baths on the Lower East Side had private rooms you could rent by the hour. He knew the hand signals, the coded phrases, the careful choreography of a world that existed entirely in the margins. But what Ralph did not know, what none of them knew, was that the world was watching. In the fall of 1890, a group of reformers calling themselves the Society for the Prevention of Crime began mapping vice in Lower Manhattan. They were not interested in gay men specifically. They were interested in all vice: prostitution, gambling, saloons that stayed open on Sundays, dance halls where respectable girls might be corrupted. But the reformers kept running into the same addresses over and over. Boarding houses where landladies asked no questions. tenement buildings where men lived 3 and 4 to a room, and neighbors reported strange sounds at night. The society hired investigators. Young men, well-dressed, who could pass as clerks or students. These investigators moved into the boarding houses. They rented rooms. They made friends. They listened. And then they reported back. The reports are kept in the New York Municipal Archives, and reading them now is like watching a trap close in slow motion. The investigators did not always understand what they were seeing. They used euphemisms. They called it degeneracy. They called it moral corruption. They called it unnatural friendship, but they saw it, and they wrote it down. One report from November 1890 describes a boarding house on Christie Street near Houston. The investigator writes, "The landlady, a Mrs. Schaefer, permits young men to entertain male visitors in their rooms at all hours. On the evening of November 12th, I observed 2 men enter a third-floor room together and remain there until past midnight. When they emerged, their clothing was disheveled, and their manner suggested intoxication or worse. I recommend this establishment be investigated by the police." Another report, from January 1891, describes 73 McDougal Street. Matilda Herman's house. The investigator writes, "This boarding house is frequented by men of effeminate manner and questionable morals. The landlady, a German woman of advanced age, appears to tolerate behavior that would not be permitted in a respectable establishment. On the evening of January 18th, I observed a gathering of approximately 8 men in the front parlour. They were drinking spirits and engaging in unseemly familiarities. I did not remain long enough to witness criminal acts, but the atmosphere was one of moral laxity. The investigator did not know Ralph Werther by name, but Ralph was almost certainly one of the 8 men in the parlour that night." The Society for the Prevention of Crime turned their reports over to the police in the spring of 1891. The police did nothing at first. They had bigger problems. Tammany Hall, the political machine that ran New York, protected the vice districts. The brothels paid. The saloons paid. The gambling dens paid. As long as the money flowed upward, the police looked the other way, but the reformers were persistent. They went to the newspapers. They went to churches. They gave speeches about moral decay and the corruption of youth and the collapse of Christian values in the great city, and slowly the pressure built. In June 1891, the police raided 9 boarding houses in a single night. They arrested 43 people. Most were charged with disorderly conduct. A few were charged with keeping a disorderly house. And 6 men whose names appeared in the New York Times the next morning, were charged with sodomy. Matilda Herman's boarding house was not raided that night, but Anna Muller's was. 21 East 4th Street was hit just after midnight. The police brought wagons. They brought reporters. They wanted a spectacle. They broke down the door, even though Anna would have opened it if they had knocked. They stormed up the stairs. They dragged men out of their rooms, some of them half-dressed, some of them in nightclothes, all of them terrified. Anna Muller was arrested. She was charged with running a disorderly house and procuring men for immoral purposes. The charge was absurd. Anna was not a madam. She was not running a brothel. She was renting rooms to men who had nowhere else to go. But the law did not care about distinctions. Anna spent 3 days in the Tombs, the notorious jail in Lower Manhattan, before her lawyer got her out on bail. The case dragged on for months. Eventually, the charges were dropped, not because Anna was innocent, but because the prosecutors could not prove she had knowingly facilitated criminal activity. The law required evidence. The police had suspicion. Suspicion was not enough. But the damage was done. After the raid, 21 East 4th Street emptied out. The men who had lived there scattered. Some moved to other boarding houses. Some left the city entirely. Some disappeared into the anonymity of tenement buildings, where no one kept records and no one asked names. The address that had been a refuge became a symbol of danger. For years afterward, men avoided East 4th Street. The police had won, even though they had not gotten convictions. Ralph Werther was terrified. He wrote in his diary, Every knock on the door makes my heart stop. Every time I see a police officer on the street, I think this is it. I think they know. I think someone has told them. I do not sleep. I barely eat. I am waiting for the end. But the end did not come. Not for Ralph. Not yet. Matilda Herman's boarding house survived the raids of 1891. Maybe the police did not have enough evidence. Maybe Matilda paid someone off. Maybe she was just lucky. Ralph never found out. He only knew that one morning in July, he came downstairs and found Matilda in the front hall, scrubbing the floor with a kind of grim determination. She looked up at him and said in her thick German accent, "You be careful now. You hear me? You be very careful." Ralph nodded. He did not ask what she meant. He already knew. The raids changed the rhythm of gay New York. The boarding houses that survived became more cautious. The front parlor gatherings stopped. Men stopped lingering in doorways. The codes became tighter. The risks became clearer. You did not bring strangers home anymore. You did not talk to men you did not know. You trusted no one except the people you had known for months, for years, the people who had as much to lose as you did. And yet, the world did not disappear. It contracted. It went deeper underground. But it did not vanish. Ralph met a man named Peter in the fall of 1891. Peter was a tailor. He worked in a shop on Grand Street, hemming trousers and mending coats for the German and Irish families who flooded into the Lower East Side. Peter was 28. He had pale blue eyes and hands scarred from years of needlework. He lived in a boarding house on Eldridge Street, a narrow building that smelled of cabbage and coal smoke. Peter and Ralph met at a coffee house on Bleecker Street, not one of the known places, just a coffee house. They sat at separate tables. They did not speak. But Ralph noticed the way Peter looked at him, and Peter noticed the way Ralph looked back. The next week, Ralph went back to the coffee house. Peter was there. This time, Peter nodded. Ralph nodded back. The week after that, they sat at the same table. They did not talk about what they were. They talked about work, about the weather, about the scandal in Tammany Hall that everyone was reading about in the papers. They talked about nothing important. But underneath the conversation, there was a question. Ralph could feel it. Peter could feel it. And one night in October, Peter said very quietly, "I have a room. It is small, but it is private, if you would like to see it." Ralph said yes. Peter's room was on the 4th floor of a building so narrow you could touch both walls if you stretched out your arms. The room had one window, one bed, one chair, and a sewing table covered in scraps of fabric. It was cold. It was cramped. It was the safest place Ralph had been in months. They were together for 3 years. Not openly. Never openly. But together. They had routines. Ralph came to Peter's room on Wednesdays and Saturdays. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they sat in silence, Peter mending clothes by lamplight, while Ralph read the newspaper aloud. Sometimes they kissed. Sometimes they did more than kiss. And sometimes, often, they just lay next to each other in the narrow bed, fully clothed, listening to the sounds of the city outside the window, grateful for the warmth of another body in the cold. Ralph wrote, "I did not know it was possible to love someone this quietly. I thought love was supposed to be grand. I thought it was supposed to announce itself. But this love is different. This love is a whisper. This love is a hand on my shoulder in the dark. This love is him falling asleep with his head on my chest, and me lying awake, afraid to move, afraid to wake him, afraid this will be the last time." Peter never wrote anything down. He was careful in ways Ralph was not. He did not keep a diary. He did not save letters. He lived his life like a man who knew he could be erased at any moment, and he was determined not to leave evidence behind. But Ralph remembered him. And because Ralph wrote it down, we know Peter existed. We know he was real. We know he loved another man in a city that would have destroyed him for it. And we know he survived long enough to matter. The boarding houses in the 1890s were not just refuges for gay men. They were refuges for anyone who did not fit. The gender non-conforming people the newspapers called fairies. The sex workers who could not afford their own apartments. The immigrants who arrived in New York with nothing and needed a cheap room while they looked for work. The young women who had run away from violent husbands or abusive fathers. The drifters, the dreamers, the people the respectable world had no space for. In his later writings, published under the pseudonym Earl Lind, and then, later, under the name Ralph Werther, Ralph described the boarding house world as a kind of shadow city, a city within the city, a place where the normal rules did not apply, where people invented their own families, their own codes, their own ways of surviving. He described men who lived as women, men who wore dresses in their rented rooms and transformed themselves after dark, men who called each other by women's names, Stella, Rosie, Violet. The historian Claire Sears, working through court records and newspaper accounts, found dozens of cases in the 1880s and 90s of men arrested for dressing in women's clothing. Most of these arrests happened in or near boarding houses. Most of the men arrested were poor. Most were immigrants. And most were forgotten as soon as the newspapers moved on to the next scandal. But Ralph remembered them. He wrote about a man named Jenny June, who lived in a boarding house on the Bowery and worked as a seamstress during the day and dressed in gowns at night. He wrote about a man named Loop the Loop, who performed at dive bars in the Tenderloin and was arrested 6 times for indecency and kept performing anyway. He wrote about these people with a kind of awed respect. He knew they were braver than he was. He knew they paid a higher price. Ralph also wrote about the landladies, the women who made the whole world possible. He described them as half mother, half outlaw. Women who had been widowed or abandoned, or simply decided they would rather run a boarding house than remarry. Women who needed the rent money and were willing to bend the rules to get it. Women who were kind, or indifferent, or opportunistic, but who, intentionally or not, created the only spaces in the city where men like Ralph could breathe. Matilda Herman died in 1895. Ralph found out weeks after it happened. She had a heart attack. She was buried in a Lutheran cemetery in Queens. Her boarding house was sold. The new landlord raised the rent and evicted half the tenants. Ralph moved out that winter. He wrote, "When Matilda died, I felt like I had lost my mother, which is absurd because she barely spoke to me. She collected the rent. She nodded at me in the hallway. That was it. But she knew what we were, and she let us stay. That was love in its way. That was the only love some of us ever got from the world." By the mid-1890s, the gay world of New York was changing. The boarding houses were still there, but they were no longer the only option. New spaces were opening up. The Slide, a basement bar on Bleecker Street where men danced together openly, became famous and infamous. Paresis Hall, on the Bowery, became a gathering place for fairies and their admirers. The Turkish baths multiplied, and a new language began to circulate. Words like invert and degenerate and homosexual, imported from Europe, started appearing in medical journals and newspaper articles. The respectable world was starting to name what it had always known existed. And naming it meant controlling it, policing it, pathologizing it. Ralph felt the shift. He wrote, "When I first came to New York, we had no name. We were just ourselves. Now they have given us names: degenerate, pervert, criminal, and the names make it easier to hunt us. Because now we are not just men who love men. We are a category, a type, a problem to be solved." The medical profession began weighing in. Doctors wrote articles about inverts and their deviant desires. Psychologists proposed treatments: cold baths, electric shocks, hypnosis, anything to cure the affliction. Sexologists like Havelock Ellis and Richard von Krafft-Ebing published case studies that read like horror stories, describing men who loved men as tragic, doomed, biologically defective. And yet, even as the language of pathology tightened around them, the men in the boarding houses kept living. They kept meeting. They kept loving. Because the alternative was unbearable. Ralph and Peter's relationship ended in 1894. Not because they stopped loving each other, because Peter got scared. A man in Peter's building had been arrested, charged with sodomy, sentenced to 2 years. Peter heard about it from the landlord. The next time Ralph came to visit, Peter would not let him in. He stood in the doorway and said, very quietly, "You cannot come here anymore. It is not safe." Ralph tried to argue. Peter shook his head. He said, "I am sorry. I am so sorry. But I cannot do this anymore. I cannot go to prison. I cannot lose everything." Ralph understood. He hated it. But he understood. They saw each other once more, months later, on the street. They did not speak. They just looked at each other. And then Peter walked away. Ralph wrote, "Losing Peter hurt more than losing Edward, because with Edward, I never knew if he left by choice. With Peter, I knew. He chose fear over love, and I do not blame him. I would have done the same if I were braver, but I am not brave. I am just stubborn. I am still here. I am still refusing to disappear." In 1895, Ralph moved to a new boarding house on West 3rd Street. This one was run by an older woman named Mrs. Callahan. Irish, sharp-tongued, unsentimental. She did not coddle her tenants, but she did not pry either. Ralph rented a room on the 2nd floor. He lived there for 2 years. During those 2 years, Ralph began writing. Not a diary anymore. Something bigger. He wanted to document what he had seen. The boarding houses, the men, the landladies, the raids, the fear, the love. He wanted to prove that men like him had existed, that they had lived full lives, that they had mattered. He wrote in secret. He hid the pages under his mattress. He knew he could never publish it under his own name. But he wrote it anyway. What Ralph could not have known, sitting in that rented room on West 3rd Street in 1897, was that his writings would survive. That decades later, scholars would find them. That historians like George Chauncey and Timothy Guilfoyle and Claire Sears would piece together the world he described and confirm that yes, it was real. Yes, it happened. Yes, there was a gay New York in the 1880s and 90s, and it was built in the boarding houses, by the men who rented rooms and the women who let them stay. Ralph also could not have known that the boarding houses he loved were already beginning to disappear, not because of the police, because of the city itself. By the late 1890s, New York was changing fast. The old tenement neighborhoods were being torn down and rebuilt. The Brooklyn Bridge had been completed. The subway was being planned. Immigrants poured in by the tens of thousands. Italians, Jews, Poles, Russians, crowding into the Lower East Side and pushing the older residents north and west. The boarding house model was fading. Young men who once would have rented a room by the week were now living in tenement apartments with their families. The landladies were aging out. Their children did not want to run boarding houses. They wanted to sell the buildings, cash out, move uptown. By 1900, many of the addresses Ralph had known were gone. 73. McDougal Street was sold and converted into a factory. 21 East 4th Street became a tenement. The boarding house on West 3rd Street where Ralph wrote his memoir was demolished in 1902 to make room for a new building. The men scattered. Some, like Ralph, stayed in New York and found new ways to survive. Some left the city. Some married women and disappeared into heterosexual respectability. Some were arrested, imprisoned, forgotten. But the world they had built did not entirely vanish. It shifted. It adapted. The gay bars and bathhouses and cruising areas that emerged in the early 20th century were built on the infrastructure the boarding houses had created. The networks, the codes, the knowledge that you were not alone, that somewhere in this enormous city there were others like you, and if you were careful and lucky, you could find them. Ralph Werther lived until 1940. He never married. He never had children. He worked a series of clerical jobs, none of them glamorous, all of them just enough to pay the rent. He lived alone in rented rooms for the rest of his life, and he kept writing. His autobiography, published in 1918 under the pseudonym Earl Lind, was called The Autobiography of an Androgyne. It is one of the earliest first-hand accounts of gay life in America. It is strange, rambling, florid, deeply melodramatic in places, and absolutely invaluable. Because Ralph did what almost no one else did. He wrote it down. He named names. He gave addresses. He described what it felt like to be a gay man in New York at the turn of the century. And because he wrote it down, we know. We know about Matilda Herman and Anna Muller. We know about 73 MacDougal Street and 21 East 4th Street. We know about the men who rented rooms and the women who let them. We know about Peter the tailor and Edward from the bookshop and the men in the front parlour drinking whiskey from chipped teacups. We know because Ralph refused to let them be forgotten. The boarding houses of Gilded Age New York were not utopias. They were not safe. They were cold, cramped, precarious spaces where men lived on the edge of ruin every single day. But they were also something else. They were proof that even in the darkest times, even under the harshest laws, people find each other. They create refuge. They build worlds in the margins, and those worlds matter. The physical texture of life in these boarding houses deserves a closer look because the details mattered. The architecture shaped the possibilities. The lack of privacy created danger, but also created opportunity. The sheer density of bodies living on top of each other made secrecy nearly impossible and simultaneously made it easier to hide in plain sight. A typical boarding house room in the 1880s measured about 10 feet by 12 feet. If you shared it with two other men, which many did, you had roughly 40 square feet of personal space. Your bed. A trunk for your clothes if you were lucky. Maybe a chair. The ceiling was low. The floorboards creaked. The walls were thin enough that you could hear conversations 3 rooms away. There was no bathroom in your room. No running water. If you needed to wash, you went down the hall to a shared washroom, a basin, a pitcher of cold water, a grimy towel that 20 other men had used that week. If you needed the toilet, you went to the privy in the back courtyard, a wooden structure that stank in summer and froze in winter and was shared by everyone in the building. Heat came from a coal stove on the ground floor. If you lived on the 4th floor, you got whatever warmth drifted up the stairwell. In January, your room was cold enough that your breath fogged. You slept in your clothes. You piled every blanket you owned on the bed and still woke up shivering. In summer, the heat was worse. No ventilation, no breeze. The brick buildings baked in the sun all day and radiated heat all night. Men slept with their windows open and still sweated through their sheets. The smell, unwashed bodies, cooking grease, coal smoke, the privy out back, was overwhelming. And yet, men like Ralph chose this. They chose the cold and the smell and the cramped quarters because the alternative was worse. The alternative was living with family who asked questions. Living in a respectable boarding house where the landlady enforced a 10 o'clock curfew and reported anyone who violated the rules. Living alone in a rented room in a building where you knew no one and had no one to turn to if the police came. The gay boarding houses offered something invaluable, proximity to others like you. You might share a room with men who were not gay. You might never speak openly about what you were, but you knew they were there. You heard them on the stairs. You saw them in the hallway. You recognized the signs. And that knowledge, that you were not the only one, was enough to make the cold and the smell and the constant fear bearable. Ralph wrote about the daily rhythms of life at 73 MacDougal Street. He woke at 6. He dressed in the dark so as not to wake his roommate. He went downstairs to the washroom and splashed cold water on his face. He walked to the warehouse on Canal Street where he worked 10-hour shifts, sorting inventory and filling orders. He ate lunch at a cheap oyster bar on Mulberry Street, 5 cents for a bowl of stew and a hunk of bread. He worked until 6. He walked home. Most nights he went straight to his room. He was tired. He read the newspaper. He wrote in his diary. He fell asleep by 9. But some nights, 2, maybe 3 times a week, Ralph went out. He walked south to the Bowery, where the streets were loud and chaotic and anonymous. He stopped at a saloon called the Black Rabbit, a dive bar wedged between a pawn shop and a Chinese laundry. The Black Rabbit was not a gay bar. It was just a bar. But it had a back room, and in the back room, men gathered. The historian George Chauncey describes the Black Rabbit as one of the early proto-gay bars of New York. It was not exclusively gay, but it was known. Men who wanted to meet other men knew to go there. The bartender knew, the regulars knew, and as long as you bought drinks and did not cause trouble, you were tolerated. Ralph went to the Black Rabbit because it was one of the few places in the city where he could sit next to another man, talk to him, maybe touch his hand under the table, and not immediately be arrested. The risk was still there. Plainclothes police officers raided the bar occasionally, but most nights it was safe enough. He described the back room as dark, smoky, smelling of beer and sweat and the cheap cologne men wore to cover the fact that they had not bathed in days. There were no chairs. Men stood along the walls or sat on upturned crates. Someone usually had a bottle of whiskey they passed around. Someone usually played the piano in the front room, badly, and the music drifted back. The men in the back room were not all the same. Some were clerks like Ralph. Some were labourers, dock workers, factory workers, men with calloused hands and exhausted faces. Some were better dressed, men who worked in offices or shops uptown and came downtown to slum. Some were fairies, men who dressed flamboyantly and spoke in exaggerated feminine voices and did not bother to hide what they were. Ralph was fascinated by the fairies. He wrote about them with a mix of admiration and fear. He admired their courage. He could not imagine living that openly, but he also feared them because they drew attention. When the police raided a bar, they arrested the fairies first. The fairies were visible. They were easy targets, and everyone else in the room knew that if the police were coming for anyone, it would be them. One of the fairies Ralph knew was a man who went by the name Princess Toto. Ralph never learned his real name. Princess Toto worked as a waiter during the day and performed at bars in the Bowery at night. He wore rouge and lipstick. He dressed in women's clothing when he could get away with it. He was arrested at least 4 times that Ralph knew of, and each time he was released after a few days in jail, and each time he went right back to performing. Ralph wrote, "Princess Toto was the bravest person I ever met. He did not care what anyone thought. He did not hide. He did not apologize. He walked through the world like he owned it, even though the world wanted him dead. I envied him. I also pitied him. Because I knew how the story would end for people like him. It always ended the same way." Ralph was right. Princess Toto was arrested again in 1893, this time on charges of gross indecency. He was sentenced to 6 months on Blackwell's Island, the notorious prison in the East River where the city sent petty criminals, drunks, and anyone else it wanted to disappear for a while. Ralph never saw him again. The back room at the Black Rabbit was where Ralph learned to navigate the unspoken rules of gay sociability in this era. You did not ask a man his real name. You did not ask where he lived or where he worked. You did not ask if he had a wife or a family. You asked what he liked to drink. You asked if he had seen the new play at the Union Square Theatre. You asked safe questions, and you waited to see if he asked unsafe ones back. If he did, if the conversation turned personal, if he asked about your roommate, or whether you lived alone, if he leaned closer when he talked, if his knee brushed yours under the table, then you made a choice. You could lean back. You could change the subject. You could finish your drink and leave. Or you could lean in. You could brush his knee back. You could say, very quietly, that you had a room nearby if he wanted to continue the conversation somewhere more private. Ralph learned to read the signals. A certain way of holding a cigarette. A certain tone of voice. A red handkerchief in a jacket pocket. These were the codes. They were not foolproof. Sometimes you misread the signs and propositioned a man who turned out to be a police informant or just a regular man who responded with his fists. But most of the time, the codes worked. Most of the time, the men in the back room were what you thought they were. Ralph met a man named James at the Black Rabbit in the winter of 1893. James was older, maybe 35. He worked as a bookkeeper for a shipping company. He was thin, balding, unremarkable in every way except for the way he looked at Ralph, like he saw him, like he understood. They talked for an hour. Then they left the bar together and walked east toward the river. They did not go back to James's boarding house or Ralph's. They walked to the docks, to a stretch of waterfront where the warehouses were locked up for the night and no one was around. They stood in the shadow of a building. They kissed. Then James said he had to go, and he left, and Ralph never saw him again. Ralph wrote, "I do not even know his last name. I do not know if James was his real name, but I remember the way he kissed me. I remember the way his hands shook. I remember thinking, this man is just as scared as I am." And somehow that made it better, because we were scared together. These brief, anonymous encounters were common. Men met in bars, in parks, on street corners. They had sex in alleyways, in cheap hotel rooms rented by the hour, in the dark corners of public bathhouses. And then they disappeared back into their separate lives. No names, no promises, no future. It sounds bleak. And in many ways it was. But it was also survival. It was the only way most men could experience intimacy in a world that criminalized their desires. And for some men, these fleeting encounters were enough. They were proof that desire existed, that it could be acted on, that for a few minutes, in a dark alley or a rented room, you could be yourself. But Ralph wanted more than that. He wanted what he had briefly found with Peter. He wanted routine. He wanted someone to come home to. He wanted love that lasted longer than one night. In 1896, Ralph moved again, this time to a boarding house on Christopher Street near the Hudson River. The neighborhood was rough, longshoremen, sailors, men who worked the docks. The boarding house was cheaper than Matilda's had been. $2 a week for a room he shared with one other man, a German immigrant named Otto, who worked at a brewery and was rarely home. The landlady was a widow named Mrs. Hennessy. She was Irish, in her 60s, with a face like a clenched fist and a voice like gravel. She did not smile. She did not make small talk. She collected rent on Fridays, and if you were late, she put your belongings on the street. She was not warm, but she was fair, and she did not ask questions. Ralph liked Christopher Street. It was rougher than McDougal, rougher than West 3rd, but it felt more honest. The men who lived there were poor. They worked hard. They drank hard. They did not pretend to be respectable, and in a strange way, that made it easier to be gay, because respectability was not an option anyway. Ralph began spending time at the docks, not to work, he still had his warehouse job, but because the docks were a known cruising area. Men met there after dark, sailors on shore leave looking for company, dock workers looking for the same. It was dangerous. The docks were poorly lit, and the police occasionally swept through and arrested anyone who looked suspicious. But it was also thrilling. Ralph described walking along the waterfront at night, the smell of salt and rotting fish and tar, the sound of water slapping against the pilings, the dark shapes of men moving in the shadows. He described the fear and the excitement braided together so tightly he could not tell them apart. One night, in the summer of 1897, Ralph met a sailor named Thomas. Thomas was 22, from Liverpool, serving on a merchant ship that was docked in New York for 2 weeks. He had dark, curly hair and a scar across his left eyebrow, and an accent Ralph could barely understand. They met near Pier 40. They did not talk much. Thomas did not speak much English, and Ralph did not speak any of whatever language Thomas was mixing with his English, but they understood each other. They went back to Ralph's room on Christopher Street. Otto was not home. They had sex. It was quick, fumbling, nothing romantic. But afterward, Thomas stayed. He lay next to Ralph in the narrow bed and smoked a cigarette and stared at the ceiling. And then he said, in halting English, "I have a man, in Liverpool. We have a room. together. Ralph asked how that was possible. How could two men live together openly? Thomas shrugged. He said, "No one cares. We say we are cousins." Ralph thought about that for a long time. The idea that somewhere, across the ocean, in a city he had never seen, there were men who lived together as couples, and no one questioned it. The idea that the world might be different somewhere else, that the danger and the secrecy and the constant fear might not be universal. He asked Thomas if he loved the man in Liverpool. Thomas nodded. He said, "Yes, but I am here, and he is there, so." They saw each other 3 more times before Thomas's ship left New York. They did not talk much. They did not make promises. But on the last night, Thomas gave Ralph a small brass button from his uniform. He said, "So you remember." Ralph kept that button for the rest of his life. The transience of relationships was one of the hardest parts of gay life in this era. Men moved constantly. They changed jobs, changed cities, disappeared without warning. A man you saw every week could vanish overnight and you would never know why. Maybe he got arrested. Maybe he got scared. Maybe he just moved on. There was no way to stay in touch, no phone numbers, no forwarding addresses. If you wanted to find someone again, you had to hope you ran into them by chance. Ralph lost track of most of the men he knew. He wrote about that loss with a kind of quiet grief. He wrote about walking past a boarding house where a former lover had lived and wondering if he was still there, or if he had moved, or if he was dead. He wrote about seeing a man on the street who looked like someone he used to know, and following him for 3 blocks before realizing it was a stranger. He wrote about the loneliness of loving people you could not hold on to, but he also wrote about the unexpected reunions, running into someone years later and recognizing them instantly, even though their hair had gone grey and their face had changed. The shock of recognition, the relief of knowing they had survived, the brief conversation on a street corner where you caught up in 5 minutes and then said goodbye again, maybe forever. In 1898, Ralph saw Edward again. Edward from the bookshop. Edward, who had kissed him in a freezing room on MacDougall Street 9 years earlier and then disappeared. Ralph was walking on 4th Avenue when he saw him. Edward was standing outside a shop, talking to another man. He looked older, tired, but it was him. Ralph stopped. He did not know if he should approach, but Edward looked up, and their eyes met, and Edward smiled. Not a big smile, just a small, sad acknowledgement. He nodded at Ralph. Ralph nodded back, and then Edward turned away and kept talking to the other man, and Ralph kept walking. Ralph wrote, "I wanted to ask him where he had been. I wanted to ask if he had been arrested, or if he had just run away, or if he had simply decided I was not worth the risk. But I did not ask, because it did not matter. He was alive. He had survived. And so had I. And in that moment, that was enough." By the late 1890s, the landscape of gay New York was shifting again. The boarding houses were still there, but they were no longer the only infrastructure. A new generation of gay bars was emerging. The Slide, on Bleecker Street, became famous as a place where men danced together openly. Paresis Hall, on the Bowery, advertised itself as a resort for inverts and their admirers. These were not hidden spaces. They were public, visible, notorious. The newspapers wrote about them. The police raided them. But they kept operating. The visibility was both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, it meant gay men had more places to go. You did not have to rely on word of mouth or luck to find other men. You could walk into a bar and know immediately that you were in the right place. On the other hand, visibility made you a target. The more visible the gay world became, the more the police cracked down. Ralph was ambivalent about the new bars. He went occasionally, but he preferred the boarding houses. The bars were too loud, too crowded, too exposed. He felt safer in a rented room with a locked door than in a basement bar where anyone could walk in. But he understood why younger men loved the bars. The bars were social in a way the boarding houses were not. You could meet a dozen men in one night. You could dance. You could drink. You could perform a version of yourself that you could never perform anywhere else. For men who were just coming into their sexuality, just beginning to understand what they were, the bars were a revelation. Ralph wrote, "I am too old for the bars. Or maybe I am just too scared. I have spent too many years being careful. I do not know how to be reckless anymore. But I am glad the bars exist. I am glad there are men who are braver than I am. I am glad the world is changing, even if I cannot change with it." The world was changing. Slowly. Unevenly. But it was changing. By 1900, the word homosexual was appearing in American newspapers and medical journals. Sexologists were writing case studies. Reformers were sounding alarms about the moral decay of the cities. The gay world was being named, categorized, studied, and once something is named, it becomes harder to ignore. Ralph saw the dangers in that. He saw how the new medical language pathologized men like him. He saw how the reformers used the visibility of gay life as an excuse to push for harsher laws, more arrests, more policing. But he also saw the possibilities. If the world was talking about homosexuality, that meant the silence was breaking. That meant men like him were no longer invisible. And invisibility, Ralph knew, was its own kind of death. In 1899, Ralph quit his warehouse job. He was 33. He was tired of sorting other people's goods for $11 a week. He found work as a clerk in a law office on Wall Street. The pay was better, $15 a week. The work was boring but easy. And for the first time in years, Ralph had money left over after paying rent. He used that money to buy books. He had always loved reading, but books were expensive and he had never been able to afford many. Now he could. He bought novels, poetry, history. He read Walt Whitman and was stunned by the Calamus poems, the barely concealed homoeroticism, the celebration of male love. He read Oscar Wilde's essays and felt a thrill of recognition. These were men like him. Men who had put their desires into words. Men who had refused to be ashamed. Ralph also used the extra money to move again. In 1900, he rented his own room for the first time. Not a shared room. His own room. It was tiny, barely big enough for a bed and a desk, but it was his. He could lock the door. He could have privacy. He could bring someone home without worrying about a roommate walking in. The room was on Perry Street, in a small boarding house run by an older woman named Mrs. DeWitt. She was the kindest landlady Ralph ever had. She baked bread on Sundays and left a loaf outside each tenant's door. She asked how his day was. She noticed when he looked tired or sad and made him tea. She never asked about his personal life, but Ralph suspected she knew. She had that look, the look of someone who had seen enough of the world to stop judging. Ralph lived on Perry Street for 5 years. Those were good years, quiet years. He worked at the law office, he read. He went to the docks occasionally, less often than before. He met men sometimes, brief encounters that never turned into anything more. He was lonely. But he was also, for the first time in years, stable. Ralph's room on Perry Street became something more than just a place to sleep. It became a kind of archive. He had started writing seriously by then, filling notebooks with observations about the boarding houses he had lived in, the men he had known, the landladies who had sheltered them. He wrote about Matilda Herman, about Anna Muller, about Mrs. Hennessy and Mrs. DeWitt. He wrote about the geography of gay New York, the addresses, the bars, the bathhouses, the street corners where men gathered after dark. He was creating a record. He knew that what he was documenting would disappear if someone did not write it down. The boarding houses were already vanishing. The old landladies were dying. The buildings were being sold, torn down, converted into something else. In another 10 years, 20 years, no one would remember that 73 McDougal Street had been a refuge. No one would remember that you could rent a room at 21 East 4th Street and bring home another man and the landlady would pretend not to notice. Ralph was determined that someone would remember, even if he had to publish under a pseudonym, even if no one read it in his lifetime. He wrote it down. The act of writing gave Ralph's life a purpose it had not had before. He was not just surviving anymore. He was witnessing. he was preserving, and in a strange way that made the loneliness more bearable. Because even if he was alone, even if he never found the lasting love he wanted, he was doing something that mattered. He was refusing to let his people be erased. In the early 1900s, Ralph began attending meetings of a group that called itself the Circle Hermaphroditos. The name was pretentious and the group was small, maybe a dozen men at most, but it was the closest thing to a gay organization that existed in New York at the time. They met once a month in the back room of a German restaurant on 2nd Avenue. They drank beer. They talked. They argued about politics, about sexology, about whether men like them were born this way or made this way, about whether they should try to pass as normal or embrace their difference. The group had been started by a man named Roland, a pianist who performed at concert halls uptown and lived a double life that would have impressed a spy. Roland was in his 40s, well-dressed, well-spoken, the kind of man who could move through respectable society without raising suspicion. But he was also deeply, committedly gay. He had a partner, a younger man named Claude, and they had lived together for 8 years, passing as cousins. Ralph admired Roland. He admired the way Roland refused to see his sexuality as a curse or a sickness. Roland had read all the European sexologists, Krafft Ebing, Havelock Ellis, Magnus Hirschfeld. He could quote them chapter and verse, but he rejected their conclusions. He did not think men who loved men were degenerate or pathological. He thought they were simply different, and he thought difference was not something to be cured. The meetings of the Circle Hermaphroditos were the first time Ralph had heard other men talk about homosexuality as something other than a tragedy. Most of the men Ralph had known treated their desires as a burden, a cross to bear, a secret that weighed them down. But Roland and the men in the circle talked about it differently. They talked about love. They talked about beauty. They talked about building lives that were worth living, even in a world that despised them. Ralph started attending regularly. He did not talk much at first. He mostly listened. But he felt less alone. And he began to see his own life differently. He had spent years thinking of himself as a victim, of the law, of society, of his own desires. But listening to Roland, he started to think of himself as something else, a survivor, a witness, a man who had loved and lost and kept going anyway. One of the other members of the circle was a man named Jack Starr. Jack was younger than Ralph, maybe 25, and he was everything Ralph was not. Bold, loud, unapologetic. Jack worked as a waiter in a restaurant in the Tenderloin, and he made no effort to hide what he was. He wore his hair long. He wore jewelry. He flirted openly with men. He had been arrested twice, and both times he had talked his way out of it. Jack terrified Ralph, but Jack also fascinated him, because Jack was proof that you could live openly, or at least more openly, and survive. Jack paid a price for his visibility. He was beaten up regularly. He was fired from jobs. He was thrown out of boarding houses. But he kept going. He refused to hide. Ralph wrote about Jack. He is braver than I could ever be. Or maybe he is just more reckless. I cannot decide which. But I envy him. I have spent my whole life being careful. I have survived by being invisible. Jack survives by being impossible to ignore. I do not know which strategy is better. I only know that mine has kept me alive, but has also kept me alone. Jack and Ralph became friends, not lovers. Jack was not interested in Ralph that way, and Ralph knew it, but friends. Jack dragged Ralph to places he would never have gone on his own. To drag balls in Harlem, where men dressed as women and danced until dawn. To bathhouses in the Bowery where the clientele was rougher and more dangerous than anything Ralph had experienced. To basement clubs where the entertainment was explicit and the alcohol was illegal and the whole enterprise felt like it could be shut down by the police at any moment. Ralph hated most of it, the noise, the crowds, the constant sense of danger. But he also loved it because it was alive, it was defiant, it was a middle finger to the world that wanted them dead. Jack introduced Ralph to the culture of the fairy balls. These were large, semi-public events where gay men, particularly the more flamboyant fairies, gathered to dance, perform, and socialize. The balls were held in rented halls, usually in Harlem or the Bowery, and they attracted hundreds of people. Some were participants, some were spectators. Some were straight people who came to gawk at the inverts like they were visiting a zoo. The balls had a complicated relationship with the law. They were technically legal. You could rent a hall and throw a party. But they were also heavily policed. Vice squads attended. Undercover officers took notes. The newspapers wrote sensationalized accounts. And occasionally the police would raid a ball, arrest everyone they could, and shut the whole thing down. But the balls kept happening because they filled a need. For the men who attended, the balls were a chance to be themselves in public, even if just for one night, to wear dresses if they wanted to dance with other men, to compete for prizes like Most Beautiful Costume or Best Waltz, to feel, for a few hours, like they were not criminals or degenerates, but just people having a good time. Ralph attended his first fairy ball in 1902. Jack had bought tickets and insisted Ralph come. Ralph was terrified. He was 41 years old. He had spent 2 decades being careful. The idea of walking into a room with hundreds of gay men, some of them in dresses, with police officers watching, felt like suicide. But he went. The ball was held in a rented hall on West 30th Street. The room was enormous, with a high ceiling and chandeliers and a wooden dance floor that creaked under the weight of hundreds of bodies. The air smelled like sweat and cheap perfume and cigarette smoke. A band played in the corner. Piano, violin, drums. The music was loud and jaunty and relentless. Ralph stood against the wall and watched. Men danced with men. Some wore suits. Some wore dresses and wigs and makeup. Some were young, barely 20. Some were older, 50 or 60. Men who had been living this life for decades. The energy in the room was electric. It was joyful. It was defiant. Ralph wrote, "I had never seen so many of us in one place. I had spent my whole life thinking we were scattered, isolated, alone. But here we were, hundreds of us, dancing, laughing, refusing to disappear. And for the first time, I understood what Jack had been trying to tell me. We are not just surviving, we are living." Halfway through the night, the police arrived, not to raid the ball, just to watch. A dozen officers in uniform stationed themselves around the edges of the room, notebooks in hand, taking names, taking notes. The music did not stop. The dancing did not stop. The men knew the police were there. They did not care. Jack grabbed Ralph's hand and pulled him onto the dance floor. Ralph tried to resist. He said he did not know how to dance. Jack said it did not matter. And then they were dancing. 2 men in suits, badly, laughing, surrounded by hundreds of others doing the same thing. And Ralph felt something he had not felt in years. He felt free. The balls became a regular part of Ralph's life. He did not go to everyone, but he went often enough. He started to recognize faces. He made acquaintances. He met men who lived double lives even more elaborate than his own. Men who were married to women, men who had children, men who held respectable jobs and then came to the balls and transformed into someone else entirely. One man Ralph met at the balls was named Charles. Charles was in his early 50s, a lawyer with an office in the financial district. He had a wife and 3 grown children. He had been married for 25 years, and he had been attending the fairy balls for almost as long. Charles did not dress in drag. He did not perform. He just came to watch, to be in the room, to spend a few hours in a space where he did not have to pretend. Ralph and Charles talked several times. Charles was sad, deeply, bone-wearily sad. He said he loved his wife. He said he loved his children, but he also said he had spent his entire adult life lying to them, and the weight of that lie was crushing him. Ralph asked why he stayed married. Charles said, "What choice do I have? I am 52 years old. I have a reputation, a career. If I left my wife, if anyone found out why, I would lose everything. So I stay, and I come here, and I pretend that this is enough." Ralph thought about Charles for a long time. He thought about the different ways men navigated this life. Some, like Jack, refused to hide. Some, like Charles, hid so well that even the people they loved did not know them. And some, like Ralph, existed somewhere in the middle, not fully hidden, not fully visible, just trying to survive without losing themselves entirely. The boarding houses had been Ralph's middle ground. They had allowed him to live a version of himself that was closer to the truth than anything else available. He did not have to pretend to be interested in women. He did not have to get married. He could rent a room, live alone or with other men, and as long as he was discreet, he could have brief encounters, brief moments of intimacy without destroying his life. But by the early 1900s, the boarding house world was changing. The old landladies were dying or retiring. Their children, who inherited the buildings, did not have the same tolerance. They wanted respectable tenants. They wanted higher rents. They wanted to move uptown, away from the poor neighborhoods where the gay world had flourished. Mrs. DeWitt, Ralph's landlady on Perry Street, died in 1905. She was 78. She had a stroke and was gone within a day. Her son took over the boarding house. He immediately raised the rent from $3 a week to $5. He installed new locks on the doors. He put up a sign in the front hall that said, "No visitors after 10 p.m. He made it clear that the lax, informal atmosphere his mother had allowed was over. Ralph stayed for 6 months. But the boarding house did not feel safe anymore. The new landlord watched everyone. He asked questions. He complained about noise. Ralph heard through the grapevine that the landlord had reported one of the tenants to the police for suspicious behavior. The tenant had been questioned but not arrested. Still, the message was clear. This was no longer a place where you could let your guard down. Ralph moved again, this time to a boarding house on West 4th Street, near Sheridan Square. The landlady was a middle-aged woman named Mrs. Albright. She was efficient, businesslike, neither warm nor cold. She collected rent. She enforced the rules. She did not pry. Ralph did not know if she would tolerate what the older landladies had tolerated. He did not test it. He kept to himself. He brought no one home. By 1906, Ralph was 45 years old. He had been living in New York for 19 years. He had survived. He had not been arrested. He had not been beaten to death in an alley. He had not been institutionalized or lobotomized or subjected to any of the treatments doctors were beginning to recommend for men like him. He had kept his job. He had kept his room. He had kept his dignity. But he was also profoundly lonely. The brief encounters that had sustained him in his 20s and 30s no longer felt like enough. He wanted what he had wanted when he first came to New York. He wanted someone to come home to. He wanted routine. He wanted a hand to hold in the dark. He wanted love. And he was beginning to accept that he might never find it. Not because love between men was impossible. He had seen it. He knew men who had partners, men who had built lives together. But those men were either very brave or very lucky, and Ralph was neither. He was careful. He was cautious. And caution, he was learning, had a cost. In 1907, Ralph met a man named William at one of the Circle Hermaphroditos meetings. William was 32, a schoolteacher from Brooklyn. He was quiet, serious, bookish. He wore wire-rimmed glasses and had ink stains on his fingers from grading papers. He was not handsome in any conventional sense, but Ralph found him beautiful. They started talking after the meetings. Long conversations about books, about politics, about the new theories of homosexuality circulating in medical journals. William had read everything. He had opinions about everything. He was sharp and funny in a dry, understated way that reminded Ralph of himself. After the third meeting, William invited Ralph to dinner. Not at a restaurant, at his apartment in Brooklyn. William said he lived alone. He said he would cook. He said very carefully that Ralph should only come if he wanted to. Ralph wanted to. William lived in a small apartment on the 3rd floor of a brownstone in Brooklyn Heights. The apartment had 2 rooms, a front room that served as both kitchen and sitting room, and a back room with a bed. The walls were lined with bookshelves. Every surface was covered with papers, books, half-finished cups of tea. It was cluttered and warm and felt more like a home than any place Ralph had lived in years. William cooked dinner, badly. The chicken was overcooked and the potatoes were undercooked and the whole meal was a disaster. They laughed about it. They ate it anyway. And then they sat on the sofa in the front room and talked until 2 a.m. Ralph wrote, "I have not felt this way in years, maybe ever. Not the rush of desire I felt with Edward, or the comfortable companionship I had with Peter, or the brief intensity of the men I met at the docks. This is different. This is slower. This is the feeling that I could talk to this man for the rest of my life and never run out of things to say." They saw each other every week after that, sometimes at William's apartment, sometimes at Ralph's room on West 4th Street. Sometimes they just walked, across the Brooklyn Bridge, through Central Park, along the waterfront. They talked. They held hands when no one was looking. They kissed in doorways and alleys and once, dangerously, on a bench in Washington Square Park at midnight. They did not live together. That would have been too risky. 2 unmarried men sharing an apartment would raise questions, but they built a life together anyway. A quiet life, a careful life, but a life. Ralph stopped going to the fairy balls. He stopped going to the docks. He did not need those places anymore. He had William. For 3 years, Ralph was happy. Not deliriously happy. Not without fear or worry. But happy in the way that comes from stability. From knowing that tomorrow will look like today. From having someone who knows you and loves you anyway. And then, in 1910, William got sick. It started with a cough. Nothing serious. Just a cold, William said. But the cold did not go away. It got worse. William started losing weight. He was tired all the time. He had fevers that came and went. Ralph begged him to see a doctor. William refused. He said doctors asked too many questions. He said he would be fine. He was not fine. By the summer of 1910, William was bedridden. Ralph visited him every day after work. He brought food. He read to William. He sat by the bed and held his hand and tried not to think about what was coming. William had tuberculosis. In 1910, that was a death sentence. There was no cure, no treatment. You either survived or you did not, and most people did not. William did not. He died in September in his apartment in Brooklyn with Ralph sitting beside him. William was 35 years old. They had been together for 3 years. It was the longest relationship Ralph ever had. Ralph wrote, "I do not know how to describe what it feels like to lose someone you are not allowed to grieve. I could not tell his family. I could not go to the funeral. I could not stand up and say, 'This man was my partner, my love, the most important person in my life.' I had to pretend I was just a friend, just a colleague, just someone who knew him casually." William's family came to Brooklyn to clean out his apartment. They found Ralph's letters. They burned them. They found a photograph of Ralph that William had kept on his desk. They threw it away. They erased every trace of Ralph from William's life. Ralph went back to the apartment one last time, after the family had left. The landlord let him in. The rooms were empty. Bare walls, bare floors, no books, no papers, no William. Ralph stood in the middle of the front room and cried for the first time since he was a child. He wrote, "They took everything. They took his books, his papers, his clothes, his life. They took the evidence that he existed. And they took me. Because I was part of that evidence. I was part of what they wanted to erase." After William died, Ralph stopped going to the Circle Hermaphroditos meetings. He stopped going anywhere. He went to work. He went home. He sat in his room on West 4th Street and stared at the wall. He thought about leaving New York, starting over somewhere else. But where would he go? Every city had the same laws, the same dangers, the same loneliness. New York, at least, was familiar. New York, at least, had the memory of the boarding houses, the addresses, the men he had known. Ralph stayed. In 1911, he moved again, this time to a boarding house on Barrow Street. The landlady was a younger woman, maybe 40, named Mrs. Gardner. She had 3 children and a husband who had abandoned her, and a boarding house that was always one missed rent payment away from foreclosure. She was too busy to pry. She barely noticed her tenants. Ralph liked that. He wanted to be invisible again. The room on Barrow Street was small and dark and smelled like mildew. Ralph did not care. He did not bring anyone home. He did not go out. He worked, he wrote, he tried to forget. But forgetting was impossible. Because everywhere Ralph looked, he saw the city changing. The old boarding houses were disappearing. The buildings were being torn down or converted. The landladies were gone. The men who had lived in those houses were scattered, dead, or hiding so deep no one could find them. And Ralph realized, with a kind of sick clarity, that the world he had known was ending. The gay New York of the 1880s and 90s, the world of boarding houses and backroom saloons and careful codes, was being replaced by something else, something more visible, but also more medicalized, more pathologized, more controlled. The newspapers were writing about homosexuality constantly now, not as a rumor or a whispered scandal, but as a social problem that needed to be solved. Doctors were proposing treatments. Lawmakers were proposing harsher penalties. Reformers were proposing institutions where men like Ralph could be locked away and cured. Ralph saw the danger. He also saw the irony. The more visible gay life became, the more dangerous it was to be gay. Visibility was supposed to be progress, but for Ralph, it felt like a trap closing. He kept writing. He wrote about the boarding houses. He wrote about the landladies. He wrote about the men. He wrote because it was the only thing he knew how to do. And he wrote because he believed, he had to believe, that someday someone would read what he had written and understand. The boarding house on Barrow Street became Ralph's monastery. He lived there for 7 years, from 1911 to 1918, and in that time he barely left except to go to work. The room was on the 4th floor, at the back of the building, overlooking a narrow courtyard filled with trash and broken furniture and a scraggly tree that never grew leaves. The window faced north. The room never got direct sunlight. In winter it was freezing. In summer it was stifling. Ralph did not care. He had stopped caring about comfort. Mrs. Gardner, the landlady, left him alone. She had her own problems. Her oldest son had died of scarlet fever. Her husband sent no money. She was constantly behind on the mortgage. The boarding house was falling apart around her, and she did not have the resources to fix it. The roof leaked. The stairs were rotting. The plumbing backed up regularly. Tenants complained, and she ignored them because there was nothing she could do. Ralph never complained. He paid his rent on time. He caused no trouble. Mrs. Gardner appreciated that. Once, when Ralph was sick with the flu and could not go to work for a week, she brought him soup. She did not ask questions. She just set the bowl on his table and left. Ralph never forgot that small kindness. The other tenants in the Barrow Street boarding house were a rotating cast of men and women who stayed a few months and then moved on. Ralph did not get to know any of them. He had learned by then that attachment was dangerous. People left. People died. People disappeared. It was easier to keep his distance. But there was one tenant Ralph noticed. A young man named Samuel who moved into the room next to Ralph's in the spring of 1913. Samuel was 19 or 20, pale and thin, with dark circles under his eyes and a nervous energy that reminded Ralph of himself at that age. Samuel worked at a factory in the garment district, sewing buttonholes 14 hours a day for $6 a week. Ralph heard Samuel through the thin walls, heard him pacing at night, heard him crying sometimes, heard him talking to himself in a language Ralph did not recognize. Maybe Yiddish, maybe Polish. Ralph knew that sound. That was the sound of a man who was alone and scared and did not know how to survive. One night, Ralph heard a different sound. Voices. 2 voices. Samuel and another man, talking low, then laughing, then silence, then sounds that made it very clear what was happening. Ralph sat in his own room, listening, and felt a strange mix of emotions. Relief that Samuel had found someone. Worry that Samuel was being too careless. Envy that Samuel at 19 had the courage to bring a man home when Ralph at 52 could barely leave his room. The next morning, Ralph saw Samuel in the hallway. Samuel looked terrified. He looked at Ralph like he was waiting to be reported, to be thrown out, to be arrested. Ralph just nodded. He said, "Good morning," and he kept walking. After that, Samuel relaxed around Ralph. Not much, but a little. They started nodding to each other in the hall. They started saying good morning. Once, when Ralph was carrying groceries up the stairs and dropped a bag, Samuel helped him pick up the scattered apples and potatoes. They did not talk, but there was an understanding. A few weeks later, Samuel knocked on Ralph's door. It was late, past 10. Ralph opened the door and found Samuel standing there, shaking. Samuel said, in halting English, "I need help. Please." Ralph let him in. Samuel sat on the edge of Ralph's bed and cried. He said the man he had been seeing, the man Ralph had heard through the walls, had been arrested, picked up in a police sweep of a known cruising area near the docks. Samuel said the man's name was Jacob. Samuel said Jacob had given the police other names, trying to bargain for a lighter sentence. Samuel was terrified that Jacob had given his name, that the police would come for him next. Ralph asked if Samuel had done anything illegal. Samuel said they had been together. In Jacob's room. Was that illegal? Ralph said yes. Technically, yes. But unless someone had witnessed it, unless Jacob testified against him, the police probably could not prove anything. Ralph said the best thing Samuel could do was stay calm, go to work, act normal, do not run. Running made you look guilty. Samuel asked what happened to men who were arrested for this. Ralph told him the truth. Some went to prison. Some went to workhouses. Some were sent to asylums where doctors tried to cure them. Some killed themselves rather than face trial. Samuel started crying again. He said he wanted to go home, back to Poland, back to his family. He said he never should have come to America. Ralph said very gently that going home would not change what he was, that men like them existed everywhere, and everywhere they were hunted, that America was dangerous, but so was Poland. So was everywhere. Samuel asked how Ralph survived. How did you live like this for so long and not go insane? Ralph did not have a good answer. He said, "You find people, you find places, you hold on to the moments when you are not alone, and you write it down so that when you are gone, someone will know you existed." Samuel stayed in Ralph's room for an hour. They did not talk much after that. Samuel just sat there, and Ralph sat beside him, and eventually Samuel stopped crying. He said thank you. He went back to his own room. The police never came for Samuel. Jacob must not have given his name, or if he did, the police did not care enough to follow up. But Samuel was never the same after that. He stopped bringing men home. He stopped going out at night. He became a ghost in the boarding house, slipping in and out so quietly, you barely noticed him. Ralph saw himself in Samuel, saw the fear, the caution, the slow process of learning that survival meant making yourself small. It broke his heart. In 1914, the war started in Europe. It did not affect New York immediately, but the newspapers were full of it. Young men were enlisting. Ships were crossing the Atlantic. The city was becoming more chaotic, more crowded, more dangerous. Ralph kept working at the law office on Wall Street. He was 53. He had been there for 15 years. He was good at his job, meticulous, reliable, invisible. His bosses liked him because he never caused problems. His co-workers barely knew he existed. But Ralph was tired. Tired of the pretense. Tired of the loneliness. Tired of living in rented rooms where the walls were thin and the heat did not work, and the only privacy you had was the few hours between getting home from work and falling asleep. He thought about William constantly. It had been 4 years since William died, and the grief had not faded. If anything, it had gotten worse, because Ralph was realizing that William had been it, his one chance at the life he wanted, and he had lost it, and he was never going to get it again. Ralph started drinking, not heavily, not enough to lose his job, but enough to take the edge off the loneliness. He would stop at a saloon on his way home from work and have a whiskey, then another, then another. He would stumble back to the boarding house and climb the 4 flights of stairs to his room and collapse on his bed fully clothed. Mrs. Gardner noticed. She did not say anything directly, but one night she stopped Ralph in the hallway and said, "You should eat something. You look like you have not eaten in days." Ralph said he was fine. Mrs. Gardner said, "No, you are not. Come downstairs. I made too much soup." Ralph followed her to the kitchen on the ground floor. Mrs. Gardner's 3 children were sitting at the table eating dinner. They stared at Ralph like he was a stranger, which he basically was. Mrs. Gardner ladled soup into a bowl and handed it to Ralph. She said, "Sit. Eat." Ralph sat. He ate. The soup was thin and watery and tasted like it had been made from vegetable scraps, but it was warm and it was food, and Ralph realized he was starving. Mrs. Gardner sat across from him and watched him eat. She said, "You have been in this house for 3 years and I do not know a thing about you. You have no visitors. You get no mail. You go to work and you come home, and that is it. That is not a life." Ralph said, "It is the life I have." Mrs. Gardner said, "Well, it is a damn sad life. You should find a wife. A man your age should not be alone." Ralph almost laughed. He said, "I do not think marriage is for me." Mrs. Gardner looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "I knew a man like you once. My brother. He never married either. He lived alone. He died alone. It was the saddest thing I ever saw." Ralph asked what happened to her brother. Mrs. Gardner said he had killed himself. Jumped off a bridge into the East River. He was 32. She said, "I do not know why he did it. He never said he was unhappy, but I think he was lonely. I think he did not know how to live the life he wanted. So he stopped living." Ralph did not know what to say. Mrs. Gardner stood up and started clearing the table. She said, "Do not be like my brother. Find something to live for." Ralph thought about that conversation for weeks. Find something to live for. The problem was, he did not know what that was anymore. He had lived for William, and William was gone. He had lived for the hope that he would find love again, but that hope was fading. He had lived for his writing, but he could not publish it, could not share it, so what was the point? In 1915, Ralph was promoted at work. Not a big promotion, just a slight raise and a new title, senior clerk. It meant nothing except a few extra dollars a week, but Ralph took the money and used it to rent a better room. He moved to a boarding house on Christopher Street, near where he had lived in the late 1890s. The neighborhood had changed. It was rougher now, more working class. The old brownstones were being converted into tenements. The streets were crowded with pushcarts and peddlers and children playing in the gutters. But Ralph liked it. It felt more honest than the uptown neighborhoods where everyone pretended to be respectable. Here people were poor, and they knew it, and they did not bother pretending otherwise. The new boarding house was run by an Italian woman named Mrs. Rossi. She was in her 30s, loud, warm, chaotic. She had 6 children who ran wild through the house. She cooked enormous pots of pasta and left them on the stove for tenants to help themselves. She yelled at everyone, her kids, her tenants, her husband, the grocer who overcharged her. But she also had a huge heart. She welcomed anyone who could pay the rent and did not cause trouble. Ralph's room was on the 2nd floor, at the front of the building, overlooking Christopher Street. It was bigger than his room on Barrow Street. It had 2 windows. It got sunlight. For the first time in years, Ralph's room felt like a place he could breathe. Mrs. Rossi took a liking to Ralph. She said he reminded her of her father. Quiet, serious, too serious. She tried to feed him constantly. She invited him to family dinners. She introduced him to her husband, a bricklayer named Gio who barely spoke English and communicated mostly through gestures and grunts. Ralph had not had this kind of warmth in years. He did not quite know what to do with it, but he accepted it. He ate Mrs. Rossi's pasta. He played cards with Gio on Sunday afternoons. He let Mrs. Rossi's children climb on him when they decided he was furniture. It was not the life he had wanted, but it was a life, and it was better than being alone. In 1916, the war in Europe intensified. America was not yet involved, but everyone knew it was coming. Young men were being drafted. Factories were retooling for munitions. The city was tense, waiting. Ralph was 55, too old to be drafted, too old to be useful in a war. He watched young men march off to training camps and felt nothing. He had spent his whole life fighting his own war, a quieter war, a war that no one acknowledged or honored, a war that had no memorials, no medals, no parades. But Ralph had survived, and that, he was beginning to realize, was its own kind of victory. In the spring of 1917, America entered the war. The city exploded with patriotic fervor, flags everywhere, rallies, speeches, young men signing up by the thousands. Ralph watched it all from a distance and thought about how easy it was to get people to care about some kinds of death and not others. Thousands of men were about to die in France. The whole country would mourn them. Monuments would be built. Their names would be carved in stone. But the men who died quietly in rented rooms, the men who were beaten to death in alleys, the men who killed themselves because they could not bear the loneliness, no one mourned them. No one remembered them. Ralph decided that he would. If no one else would remember the men he had known, the men who had lived and loved in the boarding houses of New York, then he would. He would write their names. He would tell their stories. And someday, somehow, he would make sure the world knew they had existed. He started writing more seriously. Not just notes or diary entries, but a full autobiography. He wrote about growing up in Pennsylvania, about coming to New York, about the boarding houses he had lived in, about the men he had loved and lost. He wrote about Matilda Herman and Anna Muller and Mrs. DeWitt. He wrote about Edward and Peter and William. He wrote about the fairy balls and the police raids and the constant fear. He wrote under a pseudonym. He called himself Earl Lind, a name that sounded respectable and anonymous. He knew he could never publish it under his real name. But he also knew that the story needed to be told. In 1918, Ralph finished the manuscript. It was over 300 pages. He titled it The Autobiography of an Androgyne. The title was awkward, clinical, but it was the language of the time. Androgyne, invert, earning. These were the words sexologists used to describe men like him. Ralph hated the words, but he used them because he wanted the book to be taken seriously. He tried to find a publisher. He sent the manuscript to a dozen companies. They all rejected it. Too scandalous, too explicit, too dangerous. One publisher wrote back and said, "If we published this, we would be prosecuted for obscenity." Ralph was not surprised, but he was disappointed. He had hoped that by framing his story as a scientific case study, by using the language of sexology, he could sneak it past the censors. But the censors were not interested in science. They were interested in control. Ralph put the manuscript in a box and hid it under his bed. He did not give up, but he also did not know what to do next. And then, in the fall of 1918, the influenza pandemic hit New York. People started dying by the thousands. The hospitals were overwhelmed. The morgues ran out of space. Bodies were stacked in warehouses, in churches, in the streets. The city shut down. Schools closed. Theaters closed. People stayed home, terrified. Mrs. Rossie's family was hit hard. 2 of her children got sick. One of them, a little girl named Maria, died. She was 7 years old. Mrs. Rossie was inconsolable. She stopped cooking. She stopped yelling. She just sat in the kitchen and stared at the wall. Ralph did not know how to help. He had never been good at comforting people, but he tried. He brought Mrs. Rossie tea. He sat with her. He did not say anything. He just sat. After a while, Mrs. Rossie said, "Why does God take children? What kind of God does that?" Ralph did not have an answer. He said, "I do not know." Mrs. Rossie said, "You lost someone too, did you not? I can see it. You have that look, the look of someone who is carrying a grief they cannot talk about." Ralph nodded. He said, "I lost someone, a long time ago, someone I loved very much." Mrs. Rossie asked if it was a woman. Ralph hesitated. Then he said, "No, it was not." Mrs. Rossie looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "I understand," and she never asked again. Ralph stayed at the Christopher Street boarding house until 1920. By then, the war was over. The pandemic was over. The city was trying to return to normal, whatever normal meant anymore. But Ralph knew that the world had changed. The boarding houses he had known were almost all gone. The landladies were dead. The buildings were being torn down or converted. The men who had lived in those houses were scattered, dead, or hiding so deep that no one would ever find them. The gay world of New York was changing too. The bars were getting raider. The police were getting more aggressive. The laws were getting harsher. But at the same time, new spaces were opening up. New communities were forming. New language was emerging. The word homosexual was becoming common. Gay men were starting to organize, to fight back, to demand recognition. Ralph watched all of this with a mix of hope and dread. Hope that maybe the world was finally changing. Dread that the visibility would make everything worse. In 1920, Ralph was 59 years old. He was tired, he was lonely, he was ready for his story to end. But it did not end. He kept going, because that was what he had always done. He survived. He moved one last time, to a boarding house on Horatio Street, just a few blocks from Christopher. The landlady was an older woman named Mrs. Klein. She was German, like Matilda Herman had been. She reminded Ralph of Matilda, the same no-nonsense efficiency, the same refusal to pry, the same quiet tolerance. Ralph rented a small room on the 3rd floor. It had one window, one bed, one chair. It was enough. He did not need much anymore. He kept writing. He revised his manuscript. He added new chapters. He tried again to find a publisher. And in 1922, against all odds, he found one. A small, obscure, medical publisher that specialized in sexology texts. They agreed to publish the autobiography of an androgen as a case study. They would print 500 copies. They would sell them only to doctors, researchers, and libraries. It was not the wide audience Ralph had hoped for, but it was something. It was proof that his story had been told, that the men he had known had been remembered. The book was published in 1918 under the name Earl Lind. Ralph never told anyone he was the author. He never promoted it. He never spoke about it publicly, but he kept a copy on his shelf. And sometimes, late at night, he would take it down and read passages and remember. The book found its audience slowly. Not the audience Ralph had imagined, not the general public, not the people who might have read it and felt less alone, but doctors read it, sexologists read it, researchers working on what they called the problem of inversion read it and cited it in their papers. Ralph's story became a case study, a data point, evidence in someone else's argument about what men like him were and what should be done about them. Ralph had mixed feelings about that. On one hand, he was grateful the book existed at all. Grateful that somewhere, in some library, on some researcher's shelf, there was proof that men like him had lived, had loved, had built lives in the margins. On the other hand, he hated being reduced to a specimen. He hated that his love for William, his years with Peter, his nights in Matilda Herman's front parlour, all of it had been flattened into clinical language, pathology, deviance, a case to be studied, but at least it was something. At least someone, somewhere, might read it and understand. In the years after the book was published, Ralph continued living quietly on Horatio Street. He was in his 60s now. He still worked at the law office, though his hours had been reduced. His eyesight was failing. His hands shook. He moved slowly. The younger clerks treated him with polite indifference, the way you treat an old piece of furniture that nobody wants but nobody bothers to throw away. Ralph did not mind. He had learned by then that invisibility was its own kind of safety. He had survived by being forgettable, by not making waves, by keeping his head down and his secrets buried. But he also knew that his survival had come at a cost. He had never lived openly. He had never fought back. He had spent his entire life hiding, compromising, making himself small. And while that strategy had kept him alive, it had also kept him alone. Ralph thought about the men he had known who had made different choices. Men like Jack Starr, who had refused to hide and paid the price in bruises and arrests, but also lived with a kind of fierce joy Ralph had never allowed himself. Men like Princess Toto, who had performed their truth on stage, even though they knew it would destroy them. Men like Roland, who had built a life with his partner and called it exactly what it was, love, and refused to apologize. Ralph had always thought of himself as a survivor, but late at night, in his small room on Horatio Street, he wondered if survival was enough. If living carefully, quietly, invisibly was the same thing as living at all. In 1925, Ralph retired from the law office. He was 64. They gave him a small pension, not much, but enough to pay rent and buy food. He spent his days reading, walking, sitting in Washington Square Park, watching the world go by. He had more time than he knew what to do with. He also had time to reflect, to think about the boarding houses he had lived in, the men he had loved, the landladies who had sheltered them all. He thought about how that world had functioned, not as an organized community, not as a movement, but as a network of small kindnesses. A landlady who looked the other way, a roommate who covered for you, a stranger in a bar who nodded at you across the room, and you knew instantly that you were not alone. That network had saved Ralph's life. It had saved hundreds of lives, and it had been built by people who had nothing. Poor men, immigrant women, people on the margins who had created refuge in the only spaces available to them. Ralph began writing again. Not another autobiography, something different, a history, an attempt to document the world he had known before it disappeared entirely. He wrote about the addresses, the landladies, the codes, the geography of gay New York in the 1880s and 90s. He wrote about how men found each other, how they survived, how they loved. He knew he would never publish it. It was too dangerous, too explicit, too much. But he wrote it anyway, because someone needed to remember, and if no one else would, Ralph would. In 1927, Mrs. Klein, the landlady on Horatio Street, died. She was 76. She had a heart attack in her sleep. Her daughter inherited the boarding house and immediately put it up for sale. Ralph had 3 months to find a new place to live. He was 66 years old. He had been moving from boarding house to boarding house for 40 years. And he was tired. So tired. He found a room in a tenement building on Bleecker Street. Not a boarding house, just a tenement. A 5-story walk-up filled with immigrant families, factory workers, people even poorer than Ralph. The room was on the top floor. It was tiny. It had one window that overlooked an air shaft. It was dark even at noon. The building smelled like cabbage and kerosene and unwashed bodies. But it was cheap, $2 a week, and Ralph did not need much anymore. He lived there for the rest of his life. The years blurred together. Ralph stopped going out much. His health was failing. His legs hurt. His lungs were bad. Decades of living in cold, damp rooms had taken their toll. He coughed constantly. He lost weight. He looked older than his years. But he kept writing. Sitting at a small table by the window, wrapped in blankets even in summer, he filled notebook after notebook with his memories. The boarding houses. The men. The moments of joy and terror and everything in between. He wrote about Edward, the first man who had kissed him, who had disappeared into the night and never came back. He wrote about Peter, the tailor with ink-stained hands, who had chosen fear over love and broken Ralph's heart. He wrote about William, the schoolteacher in Brooklyn, the only man Ralph had ever truly loved, who had died too young and been erased by his own family. He wrote about the landladies, Matilda Herman, who had kept them safe, Anna Mueller, who had fought the police and won, Mrs. DeWitt, who had baked bread on Sundays, Mrs. Rossi, who had fed him and treated him like family, even though she barely knew him. He wrote about the fairy balls, the back rooms, the docks at midnight, the stolen kisses in dark alleys, the constant fear, the brief moments of freedom, the love that had to live in shadows. He wrote it all down, because if he did not, no one would, and if no one remembered, it would be as if it had never happened. In 1935, Ralph had a stroke, a mild one. He survived. But his writing became shaky, barely legible. His memory started to fade. He would sit at his table and forget what he was writing about. He would start a sentence and lose the thread halfway through. He knew he was running out of time. In the spring of 1936, Ralph bundled up all his notebooks, 40 years of writing, and walked them to the New York Public Library. He asked to speak to a librarian. A young woman came to the desk. Ralph handed her the box of notebooks and said, "These are important. Please keep them. Someday someone will want to read them." The librarian looked at the box skeptically. She asked what they were. Ralph said, "A history of people no one remembers. Please, just keep them." The librarian said she would see what she could do. Ralph did not know if she understood. He did not know if the notebooks would be kept or thrown away. But he had done what he could. He had tried to leave a record. He walked back to his tenement on Bleecker Street, climbed the 5 flights of stairs, sat down at his table, and felt, for the first time in decades, a kind of peace. Ralph Werther died in 1940. He was 79 years old. He died alone in his room on Bleecker Street. A neighbor found him 3 days later when the smell started to drift into the hallway. There was no funeral, no obituary, no one to mourn him except the few people who had known him in passing and did not know his story. His belongings were thrown away. The landlord cleared out the room and rented it to someone else within a week. Ralph's clothes, his books, the photographs he had kept, all of it went into the trash, but the notebooks survived. The librarian had filed them away in the archives. And decades later, when historians began looking for evidence of gay life in early New York, they found Ralph's writing. They found his autobiography. They found his notes. They found the addresses, the names, the stories. And slowly, painstakingly, they reconstructed the world Ralph had documented. The boarding houses of Gilded Age New York, the landladies who had made it all possible, the men who had lived and loved in those narrow rooms, the network of survival that had operated in the margins for decades. George Chauncey used Ralph's writings extensively in his landmark History of Gay New York. He called Ralph one of the most important first-hand sources we have for understanding how gay men lived in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Other historians followed. They traced the addresses Ralph had mentioned. They found court records, arrest reports, newspaper articles that confirmed what Ralph had written. They proved that yes, it was real. Yes, it happened. Yes, there was a gay world in New York in the 1880s, and it was built in the boarding houses. Ralph could not have known that his notebooks would survive. He could not have known that a century later people would read his words and weep. He could not have known that the men he had loved, the landladies he had honoured, the world he had tried so hard to preserve, all of it would be remembered. But it was, because Ralph wrote it down, because he refused to let them be forgotten. The boarding houses themselves are gone. 73. MacDougal Street is now a cafe. 21 East 4th Street is a luxury apartment building. The addresses on Christopher Street, Barrow Street, Bleecker Street, all of them have been torn down or renovated beyond recognition. There are no plaques, no markers, nothing to tell you that these buildings once housed men who risked everything for a few hours of intimacy, for a stolen kiss, for the revolutionary act of being themselves. But if you walk those streets today, if you know the history, you can feel it. You can imagine the gaslight flickering on wet cobblestones. You can imagine a young man climbing 4 flights of stairs to a rented room, his heart pounding, hoping that tonight he will not be alone. You can imagine a landlady standing in her front hall, watching her tenants come and go, knowing exactly what they are and choosing to let them stay. The men who lived in those boarding houses did not have the language we have now. They did not call themselves gay. They did not have pride parades or marriage equality or legal protections. They had rented rooms, careful codes, and each other. And somehow, impossibly, They survived. Not all of them. Many were arrested, beaten, killed, erased. Many died alone and forgotten. But some survived. Some lived long enough to write it down. Some refused to disappear. Ralph Werther was one of those men. He was not a hero. He was not an activist. He was not brave in the way we usually define bravery. He hid. He compromised. He spent his whole life being careful. But he also loved. He loved Edward and Peter and William. He loved the men in Matilda's front parlour. He loved the fairies at the balls who danced like the world was not trying to destroy them. He loved the landladies who kept them safe. And he wrote it down. He preserved it. He made sure that when he was gone, we would know. And now we do. We know about the boarding houses. We know about the men who lived there. We know about the small, fierce acts of survival that built the foundation for everything that came after. The bars and the bathhouses, the organisations and the protests, Stonewall, Pride, marriage. All of it was built on the work of men like Ralph, who lived in the margins and refused to let the margins swallow them whole. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, think about them. Think about the young men climbing dark stairs to rented rooms. Think about the landladies who kept the doors unlocked. Think about the lovers who held hands in the shadows and promised each other nothing because promises were dangerous, but loved each other anyway. Think about Ralph sitting at a small table in a tenement on Bleecker Street, his hands shaking, his eyesight failing, writing by lamplight because someone needed to remember, writing for you, writing so that 100 years later you would know, you would understand, you would say their names. If this story stayed with you, the like button helps the channel reach others who would love it too. So tonight, when you fall asleep in your own bed, in a world where you can love who you want, where you can say the word gay out loud, where you can hold hands on the street without being arrested, remember that it was not always this way. Remember the men who came before. Remember the women who sheltered them. Remember the boarding houses south of 14th Street, where the gaslight flickered and the walls were thin and love happened anyway. They had no word for what they were, but they had each other. And tonight, we say their names out loud, because they could not. May your dreams be warmer than a fourth-floor room in January, softer than a straw mattress shared with strangers, and kinder than the world Ralph Werther knew. Good night, and sleep well.